Within the past few days, the Nintendo Switch 2 will have just released with a handful of launch titles ready to launch its predecessor into obscurity as quickly as possible. With the coming of this new herald, I wanted to go over my thoughts on how I think the original Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch Lite will be remembered in retrospect throughout the days to come. The Switch released on March 3rd of 2017. I will admit I was a bit late to the Nintendo Switch train at this time. In 2017 I would have been in high school, I would have been a junior, and in one of the rare moments of my existence where gaming maybe wasn't at the forefront of things I wanted to do in my leisure time, if you could believe it. I was more into dating and just generally trying to find any possible reason to get out of the house and make some memories with my friends, so when Nintendo launched its fancy family PSP, it wasn't really on my radar for things I wanted to buy with the cash I'd save up from my weekly job at the local fair. I was especially disinterested because I still had a 3DS, and the next installment of the mainline Pokemon series, Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, were announced to still be 3DS titles even though they were released after the Switch initially came out earlier the same year. I remember thinking to myself that I would hold off on getting a Switch until Nintendo finally leaned all the way into their new console instead of trying to keep one foot in the 3DS pool for as long as they could milk it, and this meant I would only be getting it once the first mainline series Pokemon game was announced in Pokemon Sword and Shield. These games came out in the tail end of 2019, and though they were and still are heavily criticized, these games were the sole reason I wanted a Nintendo Switch in the first place, as most Nintendo games weren't my cup of tea, but Pokemon was a franchise I would do almost anything for. Opening up the first main series home console Pokemon game for the first time was a feeling that I still long for. As a kid, I played a ton of Coliseum and XD assuming that it would be along those lines, but it was so much more than that. It didn't have that different a feel mechanically than 3DS titles, but the world itself felt so alive with you being able to see all the Pokemon just hanging around in their natural habitats, maybe not doing anything very interesting other than walking back and forth, but this was the breakthrough of immersion that the series really needed, I feel, to satisfy the insatiable fans and give them a sign that though the technology was still rather limited in its own way, they were still making progress in the right direction. The Switch seemed to be a good place for Nintendo to experiment with some of their staple games due to the higher power of the system comparatively to the 3DS, or even the Wii, as well as the massive popularity it had, pretty much combining those two demographics into one console, both being a handheld and having TV support with the dock. I always think it's interesting when I meet somebody who exclusively uses their Switch with the TV dock mode and says they almost never use it in handheld, when I do pretty much the opposite. I actually don't even know where my dock is at this very moment, stuffed in the closet under some comic books, I presume. This captive audience gave way for runaway hits like Breath of the Wild and Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, which are both games that chose to divert from their typical designs in order to make full use of the Switch's horsepower. Other than Nintendo's own IP titles doing rather well on the Switch, the console also had just enough power to run other console titles like Skyrim, Diablo 3, and the Borderlands series, just to name a few. This isn't entirely new for Nintendo, as big console titles were put on the Wii and even quite horrendously to the 3DS as well, but those ports never truly captured the essence of the game's full potential due to hardware restraints, but were released nonetheless to make a quick buck on poor Timmy thinking that Black Ops on the DS would be the same as on his big brother's Xbox. The Nintendo Switch had this constraint as well, as soon as it came out it was already not up to par with the mainstream consoles like PlayStation and Xbox, but was powerful enough to play popular games from just a few years prior to its release quite well with minimal issues, which is kind of amazing when you think about it. I don't think the Switch ever intended to compete with big consoles. I think they really just wanted to accommodate to their fans that wanted the chance to play their nostalgic 2012 games on handheld since the technology now existed. Besides the Steam Deck, I don't really think any other companies have come close in terms of handheld gaming. While they try, no one but Valve has even come close. Still, in my opinion, the Steam Deck kinda blows the Switch out of the water in comparison, but we're not talking about that console today. The Switch also had the genius idea of creating its own emulation system for its past console titles within their Nintendo Online Premium subscription that will only run you about $5 at the lowest tier. I only ever completed one full game on the emulator, which was the original Breath of Fire, and it felt amazing. Everything worked like it should, and I didn't have any bad experiences with the game. You could load and save state as well, though you couldn't speed the game up to make them go faster like you can on most PC emulators. Most fanbases got to eat really good through these emulators, with all the Mario and Kirby titles being present. I do feel, though, that the Pokemon fanbase was kinda shafted here, with people screaming online for even a smidge of Pokemon Red on the Game Boy emulator. All we got was spin-off games, even though they were pretty good ones. It kinda felt derivative to not include them, though I'm sure there were some issues with the licensing or whatnot through Game Freak. I love my Switch, and I love that I have it just in case a good Nintendo game ever comes out that I want to try. I think that's also my biggest issue with the console at the same time. I ended up selling my first Switch that I bought to play Pokemon Sword and Shield to one of my friends with all my games, because I realized after a year or two that I almost never used it and it was just collecting dust on my dresser, waiting for the next Fire Emblem or Pokemon to come out, or for me to get some whim to play Skyrim or something on it. And I only bought my second Switch a few years ago so that I could play Scarlet and Violet, and it's still collecting dust on the side of my bed, just waiting for a new title that probably won't come until Legend ZA releases. I think in terms of usefulness, the Switch has always been lacking to me, but this may be because I'm only a fan of a select few Nintendo titles. I think if you're a fan of everything they do, then maybe the console had a lot more significance to you as a consumer. When people started pushing for Nintendo to release whatever new console they had planned right around when Scarlet and Violet came out, I was kind of disappointed. I had just gotten a brand new Switch because I sold my last one, and here the community was outraged that their console was turning 5 or 6 and had no plans for any kind of new hardware anytime soon. I even bought my girlfriend a Switch Lite in December of 2024, right around the time the campaign for the Switch 2 really kicked into high gear, and I honestly don't regret either of these purchases because at its core, the Switch is a very solid game console. A lot of people still buy Game Boys and Nintendo DS's online to play classic Nintendo games that can only be legally accessed through buying these old consoles and playing them on their original platforms. I feel with the next entry in the Nintendo console line being the Switch 2, it kinda takes the wind out of the original Switch's sails to live on, though I don't think it's all bad. The DS was overshadowed eventually by the DSi and the 3DS that are now the go-tos for someone wanting to play DS games, and until Nintendo releases a whole new series of consoles separate from the Switch line, we're going to continue to get backwards compatibility for Switch games, I hope. So, I would now like to discuss the main point of this video, being how I think the Nintendo Switch will be remembered in the future since its day has since come and gone. I believe that the Nintendo Switch will be remembered by the younger generations as their childhood console that they ran into the ground, much like 20-somethings like myself will remember doing to their Nintendo DS's. The console will soon descend into obscurity, much like the DS Lite did, but be succeeded by however many sequels it will receive until Nintendo decides on a new industry-changing gimmick to ignite the next generation of gamers. I think much like the PS4, the Switch won't be completely phased out for quite a few years. I'm giving it anywhere from 2 to 3 years before the majority of Nintendo fans have switched over. This console will also be remembered for bringing a lot of Nintendo's handheld exclusive IPs to the big screen, reimagining what living in these worlds really meant. The original Switch, I believe, is one part of a greater piece of culture, and much like the DS, will be remembered as a series of consoles that evoked a specific feeling of progress for the company and the gaming industry as a whole. If you enjoyed this video and you have any tips or personal opinions on the Nintendo Switch and your experiences with the console, or if you just Want to chat about nerd stuff with me? Please leave it down in the comments section below and leave some suggestions for other games or consoles you'd like to see me talk about or try for future videos on this channel. I'd like to thank you all for watching. All that I ask is that if you like this video, please leave a like and subscribe down below. I will be releasing a new video every Monday.